Hey everyone, welcome to my 2.7 Spiral Abyss guide. If you're struggling to 36 star but are stuck on floor 11 and 12, this is the video for you. In it, we're going to be going over team options and strategies to beat it even for free-to-play players. I want to skip all the fluff this time because this video is going to be really long, but if you enjoy, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and follow my Twitch. My name is Braxophone, and let's clear Spiral Abyss. First things first, we're going to talk about floor 11, what's optimal for it, what you need to worry about, and then I'm going to show you guys my character builds. This section is going to be very long, so if you want to skip ahead to see the clear content or get just tips without the team portion, there are timestamps on the video that'll let you skip around. I highly advise you use them if you need them. Alright, so essentially this Abyss, unlike last Abyss, is more about damage than specific team gimmicks. So in last Abyss, you may have to have run a certain character or certain element and moved around a certain way to group up enemies and apply a certain amount of elemental gauges, but the DPS check was less. That is not necessarily the case anymore. Right now, the Abyss is all about damage output, which means that your teams need to synergize to create the highest damage possible, while also, you know, moving to the right places to group enemies and all that. So first I want to talk about some teams for floor 11. Essentially, you're going to be able to use specific teams for this floor that you will not be able to use for floor 12 as effectively. One of those teams, namely being Freeze. So if you look here at the enemies, on the first half, we have a bunch of Lava Churls, Heli Churls, Meta Churls, and then on the second half, we have a bunch of humanoid characters. Now, the humanoid characters are going to be the ones that you would want to group up with Animo if you only had one option, but ideally, you'll be able to do both. But worst case, this is your ley line floor, so as long as you know how to control the enemies or keep them away from the ley line, you don't really have to worry about a DPS check here. So floor 11, chamber 1 is actually not too bad, as long as you control enemies, which I'll talk about a little bit when we get in there. On the second chamber, we have some cryo on the first half. This means that essentially you can't run freeze on this half unless you bring like a pyro or electro, and that really kind of ruins freeze. So you're not going to want to do that on this half. And then on the second half, you can use some AoE or grouping to kill all these Fatui at once. These are going to all be out at the same time. And you can also use Animo to swirl all their shields together to take them out very quickly. And then on the last floor, if you decide to bring a Geo team for the first half, which is actually extremely viable, you can actually put these guys into a weakness state, which will actually increase the damage that you're doing to them. And overall, it's a very effective tactic. And then on the second half, you can actually bring Cryo or Electro here. The one thing is you have to have something to either deal damage through the Electro shield or take it out if you choose to. So maybe something like Pyro or Cryo would be good against the Electro Lava Churl. And then the Bishop Hatchlings do have resistances, but if you bring an Animo unit, you're fine. Or if you bring Pyro, you don't have to worry about it. So for this floor, what I decided to do, because I wanted to make it as free-to-play friendly as possible, is I tried to use all 4 stars. So what I ended up doing is going with Taser on the first half. This is your standard Taser. We're using Sucrose, Fischl, Singchul, and Beto. And what this essentially does is lets Beto gain a bunch of energy from Fischl, and Beto hits a ton of AoE damage, meaning that you're going to hit all these enemies at once. Singchul is high single target damage, but also Hydra application, which means that you can get electrocharge damage and stun lock enemies. And then with Sucrose, you also get elemental mastery buffs and deal extra damage with her elemental mastery and swirls, apply Hydra and Electro to everyone. Overall, this team has really, really good synergy, and it's super solid for the ley line floor, where you're actually going to want it to keep enemies from touching the ley line. And then it also takes out the ice floor. And this floor doesn't really have super amazing synergy for, but you can actually group up all these enemies with Sucrose anyway, so it's not too bad. And the damage output is just really solid. And then on the second half, I decided to run reverse mount quick swap, which is essentially going to be Bennett, Xiangling, Rosaria, and Kaya. And the idea here is that you're just going to be constantly reverse melting with Kaya and Rosaria, and also dealing good damage with Xiangling, and constantly generating energy for this team. This team is actually really good and really easy to play. Now, it's actually not perfect for Chamber 1, and it's totally okay if you can't 3-star Chamber 1 and you need to go on to 2 and 3 to 3-star those and then come back to Chamber 1 later. But I do manage to 3-star Chamber 1 just by trying to keep enemies away from the ley line, focusing on the samurai that deal a lot more damage, and putting down AoEs like Rosaria AoE and Xiangling Q right by the ley line so enemies can't really touch it. Overall, these two teams I found to be really solid, but for alternative teams, you can also run things like a Hu Tao team if you choose to run. Instead of Taser, you could run Hu Tao, Singchul, and you could run Geo Bros if you have access to them, or instead you could run Yilan, who's actually really good here. You can also replace Zhongli for Xiangling. Ideally, this floor is less of a damage check, but if you deal high damage, you can kind of get through all the gimmicks of it and not have to worry about anything at all. But overall, I do recommend bringing an Animo unit, whether that's Venti, Kazuha, Sucrose. I wouldn't suggest Jean or Xiao for crowd control, but they can work. Jean can push enemies away from the ley line, same with Xiao, so that is possible. If you want to make ley line floor even easier, you can bring freeze, but you can only use it on the second half because the first half does have the Cryo Abyss Mage and the Frost Arm Lava Troll, and that's going to be a huge pain in the butt. So if you choose to, you can bring freeze on the second half, and that would look something like Ayaka, Xingqiu, Diona, or Sucrose, or you could replace some of these units with other units, like if you have Kokomi, you can use her instead. And then you can replace Diona with Rosaria for more damage. There's lots of ways you can build freeze, but that can also work for the second half. Now you'll notice that it says damage dealt by Claymore wielding characters increased by 75%. This seems like it's mainly for Itto, so if you have a Geo team you want to run on the first half, you're going to get a bunch of damage bonus on Itto, and that will really help out with this Chamber 3. So a full Geo team can be good first half, and then also Diluc actually is pretty good here as well. Getting a full 75% damage bonus to him is awesome. Yula can also work. So for these two floors, I end up using Taser and I end up using Reverse Melt Quick Swap. So for the first team, I'm just going to show you guys their builds really briefly. Sucrose is on the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer. We have her on full Elemental Mastery to take full advantage of Electro Charge and to deal tons of swirl damage. Now, something you should know about Sucrose is that you actually do want to get her to level 90 if you're going to play her as a driver for something like Taser. The reason being that Elemental Mastery and swirl damage specifically will scale with your level. So a level 90 swirl with 6,886 Elemental Mastery is going to deal more damage than a level 70 swirl with 686 Elemental Mastery, and it's a really high difference, so I would highly recommend doing that. And then for her weapon, I have Sacrificial Fragments just so I can get the extra energy by getting an extra elemental skill and swirl damage, and then also it has Elemental Mastery on the main stat. You can also run Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and give this to your Beto when you use her burst, and that can also be viable, but I prefer Sacrificial Fragments. As for Xingqiu, I actually have him on the Sacrificial Sword. This is Refinement rank 5, and this is going to make it so that I can basically always get 2 kicks out of his elemental skill and get a bunch of battery back for him. He has 57, 150 crit. It's not perfect. He has 183 energy recharge though, and that is a really solid amount to have him out with Sacrificial Sword, and especially since we're running Fischl, who's going to be generating extra particles. I have him on Gladiator Heart of Depths. Honestly, stats over sets for this guy. You don't necessarily have to run him for Emblem or have the perfect pieces for him. You can actually just make sure that you have attack, hydro damage, and crit rate, or if you don't have the energy recharge you need, make sure to build an ER. And then over on Fischl, I have Thundering Fury Shimenawa. Again, this is stats over sets, so I'm using attack percent, electro damage, and crit damage. We do actually have 2-set Thundering Fury, which is actually really good for our damage, and she is using Skyward Harp. This is R2 because I'm a whale, and then you can go to details, you can see 58, 190, kind of an insane crit ratio. But overall, Fischl, even with free-to-play setups, can deal a lot of damage, and I highly recommend building her if you're going to use Taser. Lastly, we have Beto. She's going to be on the Serpent Spine, which is a Battle Pass weapon. If you don't have access to something like Serpent Spine, you can go ahead and use Prototype Archaic. That's going to be a pretty solid weapon. Akomaru is actually going to be one of her best options if you have it. The fish is also a really solid option as well, but Serpent Spine in general is my favorite weapon to use with her, specifically because it gives crit rate, and if I didn't use it, I wouldn't have the crit stats I need to actually have a viable build. So energy recharge, 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate, attack percent. Honestly, this build isn't perfect. My Beto damage is kind of low, but it's still a solid setup. All right, and then here we're using Reverse Melt Quick Swap, as I mentioned before, Benny, Xiangling, Rosaria, and Kaya. All right, so our Bennett's kind of atrocious. The only thing that matters for Bennett is what weapon you use, having 4-piece Noblesse, and then leveling up his burst to the highest level possible that you want to level it to. I wanted to level mine and crown it because it deals actually a pretty solid chunk of damage and it gives you a big attack ratio. I have him on Festering Desire. This is a free-to-play weapon that was obtainable at the early part of the game. If I didn't have something like Festering Desire, I would likely use Prototype Rancor because it has a really high base attack. Like you can see, it's actually 20 levels below Festering Desire and it has 429, which is less than 100 off. So it's a very high base attack weapon, and base attack is the only thing that matters for his burst. And then for stats, I have energy recharge, pyro damage, crit damage. Don't look at my ratio. My ratio is awful. I have about 230 energy recharge, and Bennett, when he does crit, is able to hit a giant chunk of damage. Moving on to Xiangling now. She's on a bit of a whale build, so we have Engulfing Lightning. We have her at 711 for her talents, and then we have her on 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate. Now, because I have Engulfing Lightning and I'm on ESF, I use energy recharge, and that gives her a big attack bonus. However, you can still use energy recharge on her her even without Engulfing Lightning. If you don't have Engulfing Lightning and you have Emblem of Severed Fate, you can use ER on her and use something like Deathmatch. If you have it, you can use Black Cliff. Black Cliff isn't perfect, but it has a crit stat, which is nice. And then if you have the Catch, this is going to be one of the best free-to-play options for you because it increases burst damage by 16% and crit rate by 6%, and that is really, really valuable for Xiangling. Highly recommend the Catch if you have access to it, but alternatively, you could put her on something like Favonius Lance. And Emblem of Severed Fate, the reason I'm using it over Crimson is because one, it's easier to build, and two, the pieces are more resin efficient to farm. Pyro damage, crit damage, and that's the setup. All right, next we have Rosaria. She's at 69, 144. Now, when she uses her skill, she's going to get 12 more crit rate. We have her on Noblesse Blizzard Stray. This is about 35% damage bonus. It's on her burst, 15% on her elemental skill. I have her on Deathmatch. You can use her on something like White Tassel for the crit rate if that's something you want to do. However, because she deals so much damage, I would highly recommend using something like Dragon's Bane because you get the 200 EM on the reverse melt quick swap. In this team specifically, it's actually very good. And you wouldn't put this on Xiangling in this team because Xiangling's not the one melting. It's Rosaria and Kaya melting. Favonius Lance is also pretty okay for particle generation if you find issues with that. And then the Catch can also work on Rosaria as well. Lastly, I didn't talk about this on Xiangling, but Wavebreaker's Fin can also be good on Xiangling and Rosaria, so both these characters can benefit from it, especially if you're using Bennett, who's going to give you a bunch of attack bonus. And lastly, I want to talk about our Kaya. So our Kaya has Blizzard Stray and Wanderer's Troop. The reason I picked Wanderer's Troop wasn't actually for anything in particular, it was just good stats. I wanted to make sure that I had a good stat balance here, but Wanderer's Troop is a little bit helpful for getting higher melt damage. And then I'm running him on, again, another not free-to-play weapon. This is going to be Jade Cutter. If you don't have access to Jade Cutter and you do it at the Battle Pass, Black Sword can work, especially in reverse melt quick swap where you're not using 4 Blizzard Strayer. Lion's Roar is also very good here, and if you have access to it, I didn't have it leveled and I didn't want to bring it up because that's a lot of resources, but if you have Lion's Roar or Amanome Kageuchi, these swords are both extremely good on Kaya. The thing is, he doesn't need that much ER when you're playing him with Rosaria, and he scales with energy recharge anyways when you ascend him, so overall he's actually not too hard to build. And just so you know what stats I'm using attack, cryo damage, crit damage. I think I forgot my Rosaria stats too. Attack, cryo damage, crit damage. First off, we're going to be on floor 11-1, which is a leyline floor. In the simplest terms, your goal is going to be to get enemy attention and keep them away from the leyline. Freeze, Electrocharged, and Animo can usually keep them away without too many issues. Having an Animo on this floor can be super helpful just because it lets you group and interrupt Hilichurls who are going after the leyline. There's only 3 of them at a time, so they're pretty easy to control, and some well-placed skills can take them out. The main thing you want to watch out for is the Minichurls, which are going to be running around trying to hit the leyline unless you grab their attention. If you grab their attention, then you can keep them away from the ley line successfully, and you won't have to worry about it taking any damage. This is probably the easiest ley line we've had so far. Beto is also pretty great here because her burst will jump to enemies to deal damage to them, and with Taser specifically, you're constantly stunning enemies with Electrocharged, so you're able to stop enemies from dealing too much damage or just moving around too much. Just make sure to keep those small Hilichurls away with a crowd control ability every once in a while, and you'll be solid. When you get to the end or the final enemy, you can go ahead and just charge your elemental bursts on him. You can just gather energy because it'll make the next floor easier, and there's no time limit on the leyline floors at all, so as long as you're not losing health on the leyline, you can totally just charge up your bursts. On the second half, I use Reverse Melt Quick Swap. It's not really great for this floor specifically, but it's good for every other one. So I'll be honest, this footage is a bit of a mess since there's no grouping for me, but you can definitely bring an Animo unit to group up enemies and keep them away. When clearing this floor, my plan is to focus down the Samurai since they do the most damage to the ley line. The ranged Treasure Hoarder's damage can stack up over time, but it's a lot slower than the Samurai if they get free reign. For the final wave, make sure to deal with the 3 hoarders that go straight to the ley line first, but do your best to fight them away from the ley line to not point the big samurai attacks to it. Admittedly, Freeze would have been much stronger here, but as I mentioned before, I ran Reverse Melt Quick Swap because it's good for the other 2 floors as well. Also, make sure to watch out for the treasure hoarders that run at you swinging the big club. They really want you. If you've controlled the first half well, the second half should be a breeze. Just remember to keep aggro off of the ley line and on you, and focus on the samurai first. This next floor, in my opinion, is actually easier than the first one. You'll start off with 3 Metatrolls spawning, and one of them has a dark circle below them. Try your best to kill the one with a dark circle first, since enemies with circles below them always indicate some sort of debuff or extra damage you'll receive. Then follow suit with the rest. After that, a Cryo Abyss Mage and an Ice Giga Chad Hilichurl will spawn. In my experience, defeating the Cryo Abyss Mage first makes the Giga Churl easier to deal with. If you don't defeat the Cryo Abyss Mage, you're gonna have a tiny idiot laughing at you and slowing you down with ranged ice moves while you dodge a big idiot at the same time. It's much easier to deal with one at a time, and also the Cryo Mage has less health, so he's easier to take care of first. For the second half, identify if there's any F2P you can't take care of if they get a shield. If you don't have a cryo unit, you want to focus down the Hydro and Electro F2P first. The Hydro one heals, so generally speaking, it's easiest to take them down so they don't heal their team. If you have a strong Animo character like Venti, Kazuha, or Sucrose, you can group them up to make taking them all out at once really easy. These guys don't have much health, so as long as you have a well-built team, there's not really a ton of strategy involved outside of taking care of the healer. A Mirror Maiden spawns afterwards, but she's sort of just a big health sponge. The one thing you do need to watch out for with the Mirror Maiden is her imprisonments, since they can actually deal a lot of damage to you if you're not in a healing field or don't have a shield. And if you decided to bring Freeze on the side, you can always permanently freeze her to stop her from getting away. For the first half of Chamber 3, there's a bunch of Geo Wolves. The nice thing about these guys is they're super easy to move and stun. Though they're annoying for melee characters, a team like Taser can handle them pretty well. If you happen to bring a Geo team, you can also enrage them with that Geo damage and lower the resistances. If you do, you may have to dodge more frequently or bring a strong healer since they deal damage over time after hitting you with an attack. But with that being said, this is the last floor, so if you do lose someone and you still manage to clear with a good time, it doesn't matter too much. Though Taser is strong here, it lacks a strong healer, so it's really important not to get hit if you're using it. For Geo teams, you could even bring someone like Bennett if you wanted to, just so you can Unga Bunga your way through. These guys can be grouped with Animo as well, so if you decide to bring Sucrose with you, you can suck them all up and hit them with area damage like Beto. Overall, this floor isn't too challenging if you're able to get all the enemies in one place with Animo, or bring a Geo team to take advantage of that resistance decrease. On the second half, an Electro Giga Chad Hilichurl spawns, followed by an Electro and Ice Bishop, the Enkanomiya kind. These guys aren't too tough if you play right. You essentially have two ways to play. You can either fight out in the open like I usually do because I'm an actual barbarian, or you can be smarter about it and bring the enemies to the edge of the arena. If you have a really strong healer or a shield unit, you can make it so that all of the enemies on this floor that jump and dash around actually don't move that far because of the wall. Do be careful because trapping yourself can be pretty bad, but when done right, you'll be rewarded with an easier time hitting the enemies. When the Bishops spawn, I recommend going for the Electro one first, just due to the debuff that it will continuously give you. Do your best to dodge ice attacks though, since they'll slow you down. Once you've defeated the Bishops, you're on to floor 12. Alright, so now looking at floor 12, we have a couple of options. First, let's look at the enemies. You're going to have Whopper Flowers on the first half, Geo Bishops right after, and then you're going to have Rune Graders and Ruin Guards on the second half. This is going to be one of each. The Rune Guard's going to spawn first, and then the Ruin Grader after. And then on Chamber 2, you have the Lava Churls and Cryo Slimes. This is basically what stops you from running Freeze on this side. So in general, like looking at the lineup for this floor, using Freeze is not actually that viable, and I wouldn't recommend using Freeze. You can still use Cryo units, but Freeze is just not the way to go. You're also going to have two of the Vishnabs from Enkanomiya over here on the first half, Perpetual Mechanical Array second half, Majikeki second half. So lots of bosses on the second half, lots of like trash mobs on the first half. So what this means to me is that you can use high single target second half and you can use AoE first half. So if you're a Hu Tao owner or a Diluc owner, what you can actually end up doing is you can use something like Xingqiu, Yilan, and Xiangling if you want to. This is actually pretty solid because of the pyro particles you're going to get and all the hydro particles. And if you're using Favonius on Yilan, it makes it really, really easy to survive and get that battery. And this is just good because Hu Tao's good single target. Alternatively, again, you can run cryo units, you just can't run freeze, but Ayaka's really good against bosses. Oops, not Yunjin. Ayaka is really strong against bosses. Yoimiya, if you have a good setup, can be good in single target. Geobros can also be decent here. Honestly, looking at the opponent's Xiao isn't super great for him, especially in single target against bosses. He's not perfect. You can use Xiao if you have a hyper invested Xiao, he will deal enough damage, but he's not as good as some of the other alternatives. And then Diluc is also fine here. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to run these same exact thing. I'm gonna run Sucrose Taser, and we're gonna do that with Fischl, Sinchel, and then Beto. Second half, again, we're gonna use a reverse melt quick swap, so we're gonna do this team. And the reason I'm doing this again is because the first half is a lot of area damage, and Beto really helps with that. Sucrose really helps with that. There's gonna be a lot of AoE here, whereas the second half has AoE, but it's all very controlled. It doesn't spread to other enemies, and so this will be better for bosses because what it allows you to do is place down something where the boss is, and the boss usually won't leave it. Obviously, the Maju Kenki tries to teleport anytime you put something down, but against the Perpetual Mechanical Array, this is actually really solid, and I'll show you guys why. And then once again, you can swap out some characters in Taser if you wanted to use something like Ayato Taser, where you play something like this with Sucrose in the back, or you could play something like Yelan Sinchel Taser, where you actually use Sucrose, Fischl, Sinchel, Yelan. Yelan actually is pretty solid for this Abyss, and you can find places to use her anywhere. So now that we're on to 12-1 on the first side, the first thing you want to do on this floor is bring all of the Whopper flowers together. You can do this by running backwards after activating the challenge, which will group up all the flowers into one location by you, since I'll just burrow into you. This side can also be really easy with someone like Sucrose, Kazuha, or Venti, who can group them up very well. The Whopper flowers are bulky, they have a lot of HP, but they can be grouped really easily, and stopping them from moving is pretty important. After the Whopper flowers come some Geobishops, and these guys are the same general concept. They want to move around a lot. The first thing they usually do, and I say usually because sometimes they don't do it or they delay it, is jump to where you are. They land twice, so be ready to dodge at the right time to avoid it, or you can use an elemental burst for invincibility frames. Bringing them to a corner is a little bit riskier though, since they're thick lads, so you're better off abusing AoE damage with some room to move. One is Electro and the other one is Cryo, so if you have a Pyro character on the first side, that's pretty solid too. Now, the second half to this is a little bit easier in my opinion. It's your standard Ruin Guard and Ruin Grader floor. Dodge claps, and if they start spinning, don't try to greed. As soon as you beat the Ruin Guard, immediately head to the opposite side of the room for the Ruin Grader, because if you take too long, he may sprint at you, and it could cause issues for your team and placing your bursts. If you have a bow unit, you can shoot their weak points, but it's not super necessary if you just brute force them, since they don't really get knocked back by anything and don't actually have that much health. Since they spawn one at a time, if you do happen to take a single target character like Yoimiya here, it's not really that much of an issue anyways. On to floor 2. On the second chamber, you're going to be against a ton of enemies with cryo shields. Characters like Xiangling, Beto, Hu Tao, Raiden, and other pyro and electro units make this floor really easy. Claymore characters are also good against the Metachurl shields, and you can actually just go to a corner to bring them all to you. Hitting all 3 shields at once ends up being way more productive than just taking them on one at a time. Also, if you see a big cryo slime run away without a shield, it's trying to get its shield back up, so definitely go knock it out before then. Make sure to watch out for cryo slime ice breath. It can be kind of hard to see sometimes, and it'll also chip away at your health. When the Gigachurl spawns in at the end, there's also going to be a cryo slime. Make sure to take out that cryo slime first, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. Don't end up like I did, where every single time you use Sinchel's skill, you just get frozen. The second half of the second chamber is everyone's favorite, Mr. Kinky. Something that I don't see a lot of players doing is farming particles off him at the start. Even though he's invincible for a few seconds, you can still use your elemental skills on him to farm energy for the start of the fight. Just don't use anything with a super long cooldown like Sinchel's skill for example, because you won't get it back in time, and you can't proc Sacrificial or Favonius weapons off of him. At least not while he's not activated. If you start off with all of your bursts when he's targetable, you'll likely get them back again before he transitions to phase 2. There will be a point around 66 6% health, I believe, where he just stops taking damage and starts transitioning. Make sure not to waste any of your bursts or just high damaging abilities right then, because he literally cannot take damage until he's transitioned to phase 2. When he's in phase 2, you'll have to dodge quite a bit since he makes a shadow of himself. All of his attacks are iframeable though, so you can dodge through most of it. Majukenki is an enemy that has a few attacks that he repeats over and over, and I would recommend learning these attacks by practicing fighting him in the overworld if you're struggling to recognize them. One thing that'll happen a lot is that if you plop down a burst or skill that stays in an area, he'll usually teleport away. The only way I've found to combat this is to fight him against a wall. He'll still teleport a random direction, but with a wall nearby, you have a higher chance of him not going anywhere too far. I would also avoid using ranged attacks at range. I know what I said sounds redundant, but if you're up close, he won't block shots from arrows or catalysts. If you're playing something like Melt Ganyu, make sure to stuff your bow in his face. Lastly, don't be afraid to reset on this floor. This is probably the hardest fight in this abyss, and even good players can take a couple of tries if he just teleports the wrong way or they get caught off guard by some slashes. On the final floor of Chamber 12, you'll have 2 of the Enkanomiya bishops to fight. Honestly, I don't really have a lot of tips for this one. They're kind of a pushover. If you have trouble grouping them, you can take them to the wall since they're fairly easy to dodge, but even easier, in my opinion, is just to stun lock them with Electro Charged. You don't even have to kill them at the same time, so just smack them around as much as possible. Blow all of your resources on them, it's the last floor. On the second half, there's the perpetual mechanical array. There's some things you can do to optimize here. First off, just know that my rotation in this segment is really scuffed, and it kind of has been throughout the rest of the video, so don't try to copy exactly what I'm doing. I have some guides on these characters and these teams if you go look through my videos, but my point in saying this now is that there are key points you can recover your rotation in the middle of the fight. One of those times is when he spawns a bunch of adds where you can farm up all your burst right as you kill the add, so that way you can use them all on the weakened perpetual mechanical array. Second off, the mechanical array is just a giant DPS check. The fight's not terribly hard, you just have to output a ridiculous amount of damage. If you're using someone like Bennett who has an area buff, do your best to fight inside of that circle, because the array will eventually fly up and target you, then drop down. You want it to drop in the circle so you can keep your buff. Dodging with iframes to place the buff is also fine too, just make sure not to move too far away from it, because then you'll lose that uptime. For the PMA, there is one move that you want to watch out for, and that's the laser move. Basically, when the PMA targets you with a laser, you cancel it out by running behind the PMA, so you don't have to constantly dodge to avoid damage. It will literally stop attacking with the laser as soon as you're out of its view. Once you reach roughly 30% HP on the PMA, or after around 30 to 40 seconds, the PMA is going to enter its invulnerability phase. During this, it spawns 4 enemies, with one having a ring around it to indicate that it will have a health pool and that you need to defeat it. After you defeat it, the PMA will lose a bunch of resistances, and you can deal enhanced damage to it. What I recommend doing here is bringing the ruin enemy that you're fighting over to where the PMA is, so that as soon as the ruin enemy is dead, you can start hitting the PMA again. I was fighting the ruin enemy that teleports backwards when it feels unsafe or something. I don't remember exactly the details, but what I did is I sat on the outside of it, and so that way when it teleported, it went backwards into the PMA, so that way I could defeat it, and then already have all of my buffs down right next to the boss. Try your best to get all of your bursts back up before PMA spawns as well, since that'll be a massive opportunity for damage. If you time it right and focus all of your damage into the PMA in its weakened state, it'll likely let you take out most of its HP in that one go. And as long as you're dealing enough damage, you're not going to have to see it go into invulnerability a second time. Hopefully you should be able to defeat it by then. Know that reactions are always going to be very, very strong, and that building a team focused around reactions like the one that I have, Reverse Melt Quick Swap, is going to be very helpful for increasing your overall DPS, and that's why team comp is so important for the Spiral Abyss. But after all of that, you should have cleared Abyss with hopefully 36 stars. Those are all the tips that I have for you after beating the Abyss a few times with a few different team comps and doing it live at twitch.tv/Braxophone. If this has been really helpful for you, make sure to let me know in the comments. I hope that this helps you guys clear the Abyss, and if you enjoy, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll catch you next time.